Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey through history's most uncomfortable truths. Tonight we're heading west into the American frontier, where manifest destiny met reality and reality won by a landslide of death, disease, and disappointment. Before we set out on this wagon train to nowhere good, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy falling asleep to tales of historical suffering, and subscribe only if you genuinely want more content about why the past was essentially one long exercise in creative ways to die. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining me for these midnight reality checks. Now settle in, maybe grab a snack that wasn't preserved in a barrel for 6 months while crossing the plains, and let's explore why heading west in the 1800s was like voluntarily signing up for every possible way the natural world could kill you, with a few extra human-made disasters thrown in for variety. Chapter 1. The Journey West, a 6-month death march. The overland journey to the American West was essentially a 2,000-mile endurance test designed by people who apparently thought the best way to start a new life was to spend 6 months trying not to die while walking across a continent. The Oregon Trail, California Trail, and other Western routes were littered with graves of people who discovered too late that "go west, young man" was terrible advice. Wagon preparation was the first opportunity for pioneers to make fatal mistakes. Families had to pack everything they'd need for 6 months on the trail plus everything required to start a new life, all while keeping the total weight under what their oxen could pull. This led to impossible decisions about what to bring and what to leave behind, often resulting in inadequate supplies of essential items like food, medicine, and tools. The covered wagons themselves were basically wooden boxes on wheels, designed more for cargo than human comfort. There was no suspension system, no protection from weather, and certainly no bathroom facilities. Families spent months cramped together in a space roughly the size of a modern pickup truck bed, bouncing over rocks and ruts while trying to maintain some semblance of civilization. Oxen were the preferred draft animals because they were strong and could survive on prairie grass. But they were also slow, stubborn, and prone to disease. A typical ox team could manage about 15 miles per day under good conditions, which meant the journey took 4 to 6 months depending on weather, terrain, and how many disasters occurred along the way. Food supplies had to last the entire journey with no opportunity for resupply except at a few expensive trading posts. Pioneers packed flour, bacon, beans, coffee, and sugar in quantities calculated to prevent starvation, but these calculations often proved inadequate. Running out of food on the trail meant choosing between turning back and losing everything invested in the journey, or continuing west and hoping to find game or trade with other travelers. Water was a constant concern on routes that crossed hundreds of miles of arid terrain. Pioneers had to carry enough water for cooking and drinking while finding sources along the trail that weren't contaminated with alkali, animal waste, or disease. Bad water could kill faster than starvation, but good water was often days apart on the most difficult sections of Western trails. Weather turned every season into a different kind of nightmare. Spring departures meant mud, flooding, and swollen rivers. Summer brought heat exhaustion, dehydration, and prairie fires. Fall threatened early winter storms that could trap wagon trains in mountain passes. Winter travel was virtually impossible, leaving pioneers who started late facing starvation in temporary shelters. River crossings were major hazards that claimed numerous lives and destroyed wagons and supplies. Pioneers had to ford rivers that were too deep for their wagons, too swift for their animals, and too cold for human survival. Drowning was common, and losing a wagon to river currents meant losing everything needed for survival in the wilderness. Disease spread rapidly through wagon trains where hundreds of people shared water sources and camped in close proximity. Cholera, dysentery, smallpox, and other illnesses could kill entire families in days. Medical care was limited to whatever folk remedies people brought from home, and isolation in the wilderness meant that serious illness usually meant death. Accidents were frequent and often fatal on a journey that required people to work with dangerous animals, heavy equipment, and firearms while exhausted and stressed. Getting crushed by wagon wheels, trampled by oxen, or shot accidentally were common ways to die on the trail. Injuries that would be minor inconveniences today became life-threatening emergencies without proper medical care. Indian attacks were less common than Hollywood suggests, but conflicts did occur, particularly in areas where tribes were defending their territory from encroachment. More often, interactions with Native Americans involved trading or assistance, but the constant fear of attack added psychological stress to an already difficult journey. Equipment failures could strand wagon trains in the middle of nowhere with no way to continue or return. Broken axles, worn-out wheels, and dead oxen left families stranded hundreds of miles from help. Wagon trains sometimes abandoned disabled families rather than risk everyone's survival, creating situations where people were left to die alone in the wilderness. Chapter 2: Homesteading Turning Wilderness into Failure. Once pioneers survived the journey west, they faced the even greater challenge of creating functional farms and communities in territories that had defeated previous attempts at settlement. Homesteading was essentially an exercise in optimistic self-delusion, where families bet their lives on their ability to turn wilderness into productive farmland using nothing but determination and primitive tools. Land selection was often based on incomplete information or deliberate misrepresentation by land speculators who had never seen the territories they were selling. Pioneers might travel 2,000 miles to discover that their fertile farmland was actually desert, swamp, or rocky hillside unsuitable for agriculture. By the time they made this discovery, they had no money left to go elsewhere and no choice but to make the best of an impossible situation. House construction had to be completed quickly using whatever materials were available locally. In forested areas, pioneers built log cabins that were drafty, dark, and vulnerable to fire. On the plains, sod houses were constructed from cut prairie grass, creating homes that were essentially caves with dirt walls that leaked, harbored insects, and could collapse without warning. Tool shortages created impossible challenges for people trying to clear land, build structures, and establish farms. A family might own a few basic implements like axes, saws, and plows, but specialized tools were expensive and difficult to obtain in frontier territories. Pioneers had to improvise solutions using inadequate equipment, leading to inferior results and frequent accidents. Soil preparation required clearing trees, removing stumps, and breaking prairie sod using hand tools and animal power. This backbreaking work took years to complete and had to be done while families were also building homes, establishing livestock, and trying to grow enough food to survive. Many pioneers discovered too late that their land was unsuitable for agriculture despite years of preparation. Seed and livestock acquisition was expensive and risky in territories where suppliers were scarce and transportation was difficult. Pioneers often paid inflated prices for poor quality seeds and sickly animals, then watched their investments die from disease or harsh conditions. Starting a farm required significant capital that most families didn't have and couldn't obtain through frontier lending. Weather patterns in Western territories were more extreme and unpredictable than what pioneers had experienced in eastern states. Droughts, floods, hailstorms, tornadoes, and temperature extremes destroyed crops and killed livestock with little warning. Pioneers who had been successful farmers in mild eastern climates found themselves completely unprepared for Western weather. Isolation meant that frontier families lived months without contact with other people, making every emergency potentially fatal. A broken leg, difficult childbirth, or serious illness could kill someone who would have survived easily with access to medical care or community support. The psychological stress of isolation also led to depression, alcoholism, and family violence. Economic sustainability was nearly impossible for homesteaders who had to be completely self-sufficient while also generating cash crops to pay for essential supplies. Frontier families needed to produce their own food, clothing, tools, and shelter while also growing surplus crops that could be sold for money to buy what they couldn't make themselves. Supply shortages were constant problems in territories that were hundreds of miles from established supply lines. Basic necessities like salt, sugar, metal goods, and medicine were expensive when available and completely unavailable during winter months when transportation was impossible. Families had to plan a year in advance for supplies that might not arrive. Educational opportunities for children were non-existent in most frontier settlements, creating generations of functional illiterates who had no opportunities for advancement beyond subsistence farming. Children were needed for farm labor rather than schooling, ensuring that frontier families remained trapped in cycles of poverty and isolation. Medical care was limited to folk remedies and whatever treatments family members could provide using available materials. Serious injuries and illnesses were usually fatal, and childbirth was particularly dangerous for women who had no access to experienced midwives or medical assistance. Frontier families expected to lose several children and had burial plots ready before they were needed. Infrastructure development was left to individual families and small communities that lacked the resources to build roads, bridges, schools, or other essential facilities. This created isolated settlements that remained primitive and vulnerable for decades after initial settlement, if they survived at all. Chapter 3: Disease and Medical Nightmares. Frontier medicine was a horrifying combination of folk remedies, religious faith, and desperate improvisation practiced by people who had no medical training and limited access to supplies or information. Getting sick on the frontier was essentially a death sentence served with a side of painful, ineffective treatments that often made conditions worse. Cholera was the most feared disease on the frontier, capable of killing healthy adults within hours of the first symptoms. The disease spread rapidly through contaminated water supplies and poor sanitation, turning entire settlements into ghost towns. Pioneers had no understanding of how cholera transmitted and no effective treatments, leading to panic and abandonment of sick family members. Malaria was endemic in areas with standing water, causing recurring fevers that weakened settlers and made them vulnerable to other diseases. The connection between mosquitoes and malaria wasn't understood, so pioneers had no way to prevent infection except avoiding swampy areas, which wasn't always possible when establishing settlements near water sources. Dysentery from contaminated food and water was a constant threat that could kill through dehydration and weakness. Frontier sanitation was virtually non-existent, with human waste often contaminating water supplies used for drinking and cooking. The cycle of contamination and reinfection made dysentery a chronic problem in many frontier communities. Smallpox outbreaks could devastate isolated communities that had no immunity and no access to vaccination. The disease was particularly deadly for Native American populations, but frontier settlers were also vulnerable if they hadn't been exposed to smallpox in childhood. Quarantine was impossible in small communities where everyone was needed for essential work. Typhoid fever spread through poor sanitation and contaminated water, causing prolonged illness that often ended in death. The disease was difficult to distinguish from other fever-causing illnesses, leading to delayed treatment and continued spread through families and communities that couldn't afford to isolate sick members. Pneumonia was a common killer during harsh frontier winters when people lived in poorly heated, drafty homes while performing physical labor in extreme cold. The combination of poor nutrition, exhaustion, and exposure made respiratory infections particularly deadly for people who had no access to effective treatments. Tuberculosis spread easily in crowded frontier conditions where families shared small living spaces and had poor nutrition. The disease was a slow killer that weakened victims over months or years, making them unable to contribute to family survival while consuming precious resources. Childbirth complications killed many frontier women who had no access to experienced midwives or medical assistance. Difficult deliveries, infections, and hemorrhaging were often fatal in situations where help was days or weeks away. Women faced each pregnancy knowing they might not survive to see their child grow up. Injuries from accidents, animal attacks, and violence were often fatal due to infection and inadequate treatment. A broken bone could become gangrenous and require amputation with crude tools and no anesthesia. Minor cuts could become infected and kill through blood poisoning when no antiseptics were available for wound care. Dental problems caused severe pain and potentially fatal infections in people who had no access to dental care. Tooth extraction was performed with crude tools by whoever was brave enough to attempt it, often leading to broken jaws and serious infections. Dental abscesses could spread to the brain and cause death. Mental health problems were common but completely misunderstood on the frontier, where isolation, trauma, and stress created depression, anxiety, and psychotic episodes. People suffering from mental illness were often abandoned, restrained, or killed by family members who had no understanding of psychological conditions and no resources to provide care. Substance abuse was widespread among frontier populations who used alcohol and patent medicines containing opium and cocaine to cope with pain, stress, and boredom. These substances were often the only pain relief available, leading to addiction problems that made frontier life even more difficult and dangerous. Veterinary medicine was equally primitive, with sick livestock often representing the difference between survival and starvation for frontier families. Animal diseases could spread rapidly through small herds, wiping out families' economic foundations and leaving them without transportation, food, or income. Chapter 4: Violence and Lawlessness. The American frontier was a place where violence was a daily reality and law enforcement was either non-existent or completely corrupt. Disputes were settled with guns, property was protected through personal force, and justice was administered by whoever had the most firepower and the willingness to use it. Gunfights were not romantic duels between honorable opponents but desperate struggles between frightened people who usually had poor aim and inferior weapons. Most shootings involved multiple participants firing wildly at close range, often hitting innocent bystanders rather than intended targets. Survival often depended more on luck than skill or courage. Vigilante justice emerged in communities where official law enforcement was absent or ineffective. Citizens would form committees to identify and punish suspected criminals, often hanging people based on rumors or circumstantial evidence. These extrajudicial executions sometimes targeted innocent people while allowing real criminals to escape punishment. Cattle rustling was a major problem that could destroy families' livelihoods overnight. Stealing livestock was relatively easy in territories with poor record-keeping and minimal law enforcement, but defending herds required constant vigilance and willingness to engage in armed conflict. Range wars between competing cattlemen killed hundreds of people over grazing rights and water access. Claim jumping involved armed groups seizing valuable mining claims or homesteads from their rightful owners. Legal titles were often unclear or disputed, creating situations where possession was determined by force rather than law. Families could lose everything they had worked for to better armed neighbors who simply decided to take their property. Banditry was common on frontier trails where travelers carried valuable goods and had no protection from law enforcement. Road agents would rob wagon trains, stagecoaches, and individual travelers, often killing victims to prevent identification. The isolation of frontier travel made robbery easy and detection nearly impossible. Indian warfare created cycles of violence and retaliation that made frontier life extremely dangerous for both settlers and Native Americans. Conflicts over land and resources escalated into raids, massacres, and military campaigns that killed thousands of people and displaced entire populations. Neither side showed mercy to enemies or civilians. Domestic violence was endemic in frontier communities where alcohol abuse, stress, and isolation created explosive family situations. Women and children had no legal protection from abusive husbands and fathers, and social services didn't exist to provide assistance or intervention. Family violence often escalated to murder-suicide scenarios. Dueling was a common method of settling disputes between men who considered themselves gentlemen but lacked access to legal remedies. These formal combat encounters were often fatal and served no purpose except satisfying wounded pride. Communities lost valuable members to dueling while real problems remained unresolved. Lynch mobs formed quickly in frontier communities where rumors of crime could result in immediate execution without trial or investigation. Mob justice was often directed at minority groups or unpopular individuals rather than actual criminals. These extrajudicial killings created climates of fear and intimidation that made frontier life even more dangerous. Military conflicts between different ethnic and cultural groups created ongoing warfare that made large areas uninhabitable for civilian populations. The frontier was essentially a war zone where different groups competed for resources and territory through violence. Peaceful coexistence was rare and temporary. Criminal organizations operated with impunity in territories where law enforcement was weak or corrupt. Gangs of outlaws could control entire regions, taxing legitimate businesses and killing anyone who opposed them. Some frontier communities were essentially run by criminal enterprises that provided protection in exchange for tribute. Corrupt officials often represented the only available law enforcement but used their positions to extort money and settle personal disputes rather than maintain order. Sheriffs, judges, and other authorities might be more dangerous than the criminals they were supposed to control. Citizens had no recourse against corrupt officials who had legal authority to use violence. Chapter 5: Economic Disasters and Failed Dreams. The economic realities of frontier life destroyed the dreams of thousands of families who discovered that the American West was not a land of opportunity, but a place where hard work and determination were rewarded with bankruptcy, starvation, and despair. Crop failures were common in territories with unpredictable weather, poor soil, and inadequate irrigation. Pioneers who had invested everything in establishing farms could lose entire seasons of work to drought, floods, pests, or disease. Without crop insurance or government assistance, a single bad harvest often meant losing the farm and returning east in poverty. Mining speculation created boom and bust cycles that enriched a few people while impoverishing thousands of others. Most gold rush participants arrived too late to find easily accessible gold and ended up working as laborers for established mining companies. The costs of mining equipment, supplies, and transportation often exceeded any gold found, leaving prospectors poorer than when they started. Transportation costs made it expensive to move goods to and from frontier territories, creating economic isolation that prevented farmers and businesses from competing in larger markets. The expense of shipping crops east often exceeded their sale value, while manufactured goods cost several times their eastern prices due to transportation expenses. Market manipulation by railroad companies and grain dealers cheated frontier farmers out of fair prices for their crops while charging inflated rates for shipping and storage. Monopolistic practices made it impossible for independent farmers to earn profits adequate to support their families, creating debt cycles that led to farm foreclosures. Bank failures were common in frontier territories where financial institutions were undercapitalized and poorly regulated. Families could lose their savings overnight when local banks collapsed, often taking their farms and businesses with them. The lack of federal deposit insurance meant that bank failures created widespread economic devastation. Land speculation created artificial scarcity and inflated prices that made it difficult for legitimate settlers to acquire good farmland. Speculators would buy large tracts of land and hold them until prices rose, forcing actual farmers to purchase inferior land at inflated prices or go deeper into debt than their farming operations could support. Equipment costs were enormous for farmers who needed specialized tools for frontier agriculture but had limited access to credit or cash. A basic farming setup cost more than most families could afford, forcing them to work with inadequate equipment that reduced productivity and increased labor requirements. Labor shortages made it difficult to complete essential work during critical periods like planting and harvest seasons. Frontier families often had to choose between completing necessary work and caring for sick family members, maintaining equipment, or addressing other urgent needs. The lack of available labor made farming operations less efficient and more stressful. Supply chain disruptions could leave frontier communities without essential goods for months at a time. Bad weather, Indian conflicts, or transportation failures could interrupt supply deliveries, creating shortages of food, medicine, tools, and other necessities that frontier families couldn't produce themselves. Debt accumulation was almost inevitable for frontier families who had to borrow money for land, equipment, and supplies while waiting for crops to mature and generate income. Interest rates were high, repayment terms were strict, and crop failures or market downturns could make debts impossible to repay, leading to foreclosure and loss of everything families had worked to build. Insurance was unavailable for most frontier risks, leaving families vulnerable to total loss from weather disasters, accidents, disease, or violence. A single catastrophic event could destroy years of work and investment with no possibility of recovery or compensation. Government policies often worked against frontier settlers through land policies that favored large corporations, tax systems that penalized small farmers, and trade regulations that benefited Eastern manufacturers at the expense of Western producers. The political system was designed to extract wealth from frontier territories rather than support their development. Chapter 6: Winter Survival, the Season of Death. Winter on the American frontier was a 6-month siege that tested every aspect of survival skills, family relationships, and community cooperation. For many pioneers, winter was simply a slow-motion disaster that began with the first frost and didn't end until spring thaw revealed which families had survived and which had not. Food preservation was a life-or-death challenge in an era without refrigeration or reliable canning techniques. Families had to smoke, salt, dry, or store enough food to last 6 months while preventing spoilage from insects, rodents, and mold. A single mistake in food preservation could mean starvation before spring arrived with fresh sources of nutrition. Fuel shortages were common in areas where wood was scarce or difficult to harvest and transport. Families might have to choose between heating their homes and cooking their food, leading to situations where people froze to death in their own homes or ate raw food to conserve heating fuel. Buffalo chips and dried grass were poor substitutes for wood in areas without forests. Housing inadequacy became critical during winter months when poorly constructed homes provided insufficient protection from cold, wind, and snow. Sod houses collapsed under heavy snow loads, log cabins had gaps that let in freezing air, and many frontier homes had no proper foundations or insulation. Families crowded together for warmth in buildings that were barely better than being outdoors. Clothing shortages left frontier families inadequately dressed for severe winter weather. Wool was expensive and difficult to obtain, leather goods were often of poor quality, and many pioneers wore whatever clothes they had brought from milder climates. Frostbite, hypothermia, and cold-related injuries were common among people who simply didn't have adequate winter clothing. Medical emergencies during winter often proved fatal because doctors were unavailable and transportation to medical care was impossible. Broken bones, difficult childbirths, and serious illnesses that would have been treatable during other seasons became death sentences when families were isolated by snow and ice. Emergency medical care didn't exist in frontier communities during winter months. Livestock care became extremely difficult when animals needed shelter and feed that many families couldn't provide. Cattle and horses would freeze to death or starve when families couldn't afford barns, feed, or the labor required to care for them properly. Losing livestock during winter meant losing transportation, food sources, and economic assets essential for survival. Social isolation during winter months created psychological problems that manifested as depression, alcoholism, domestic violence, and suicide. Families were trapped together in small spaces for months with no outside contact, entertainment, or relief from interpersonal tensions. Cabin fever was a real phenomenon that destroyed relationships and sometimes led to violence. Supply depletion occurred when families ran out of essential items like medicine, salt, ammunition, or lamp oil during winter months when resupply was impossible. Running out of critical supplies could mean death from untreated illness, malnutrition from improperly preserved food, or inability to defend against threats. Weather disasters like blizzards, ice storms, and extreme cold snaps could kill entire families without warning. Pioneer homes provided minimal protection against severe weather, and families caught unprepared could freeze to death in hours. Weather prediction was primitive, giving families little warning of approaching deadly storms. Fire hazards increased during winter when families used more heating fuel and candles for light while living in wooden structures with poor ventilation. House fires during winter were often fatal because families couldn't escape quickly through snow-blocked doors and windows, and fire spread rapidly through dry wooden buildings. Water access became problematic when wells froze and natural water sources were covered with ice. Families had to melt snow for water, which required additional fuel and time while providing water that might be contaminated with animal waste or other pollutants. Dehydration was possible even in winter when clean water wasn't available. Planning failures killed families who hadn't adequately prepared for winter's challenges. Underestimating food requirements, fuel needs, or weather severity could prove fatal for families who discovered too late that their preparations were inadequate. Winter was unforgiving to people who made mistakes in judgment or preparation. Conclusion: why manifest destiny was actually manifest disaster. As we conclude our journey through the particular hell that was frontier life, it's worth reflecting on the fact that the winning of the West was actually one of history's largest exercises in mass suffering, where thousands of families voluntarily subjected themselves to conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards. The mythology of the American frontier celebrates the courage and determination of pioneers who supposedly tamed a wild continent through hard work and perseverance. The reality was that most frontier ventures failed catastrophically, leaving families poorer, sicker, and more desperate than when they started. For every success story, there were dozens of failures that ended in death, bankruptcy, or retreat to eastern cities. Modern romanticization of frontier life ignores the brutal realities of disease, violence, isolation, and economic failure that characterized the actual pioneer experience. Hollywood westerns and historical narratives focus on dramatic gunfights and heroic adventures, while overlooking the mundane suffering that defined daily life for people who were usually just trying to survive until tomorrow. The environmental costs of frontier settlement were enormous, with pioneers clear-cutting forests, overhunting wildlife, and using agricultural techniques that led to soil exhaustion and erosion. Much of the environmental damage created by 19th century settlement is still visible today in the form of abandoned mining sites, degraded farmland, and extinct species. The human costs included not just the pioneers themselves, but also the Native American populations who were displaced, killed, or forced onto reservations to make room for settlers who usually failed to create sustainable communities anyway. The frontier was essentially a massive land grab that destroyed existing societies while creating new forms of suffering for everyone involved. Government policies encouraged frontier settlement through land giveaways and promotional campaigns that misrepresented the challenges and opportunities of Western territories. These policies were designed to promote territorial expansion rather than human welfare, creating situations where families were essentially used as expendable tools of national policy. So the next time you're watching a Western or reading about the romance of frontier life, remember that the real pioneers were ordinary people who made extraordinarily poor decisions based on misleading information and desperate circumstances. They deserved better than the suffering they endured, and their stories deserve to be told honestly rather than mythologized. The frontier experience teaches us that individual courage and determination aren't sufficient to overcome systemic problems like inadequate infrastructure, poor government policies, and hostile environments. The pioneers who survived did so largely through luck rather than virtue, while those who died were victims of circumstances beyond their control rather than personal failures. Sleep well tonight, knowing that tomorrow you won't wake up in a sod house, you won't have to worry about cholera in your water supply, and nobody's going to shoot you over a property dispute. The American frontier may have contributed to national expansion, but it was fundamentally a humanitarian disaster that we're fortunate to have survived as a society. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the reality behind manifest destiny. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this exploration of historical suffering, and let me know in the comments what other romanticized historical periods you'd like me to examine with brutal honesty. Until next time, stay grateful for modern civilization and remember, the good old days weren't actually good for the people who had to live through them.